You do not belong here." The words exploded through the conference hall so suddenly that every conversation stopped. Hundreds of heads turned at once. Investors, journalists, software engineers, startup founders, and executives all looked toward the front of the room, where a 16-year-old black teenager stood beside the presentation stage holding an old silver laptop with a crack running across one corner. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Jaden Brooks tightened his grip on the laptop and felt his heart pounding against his ribs. The giant screens hanging above the stage reflected the bright lights of the annual Technology Summit, one of the most prestigious innovation events in California. He had dreamed about being here for nearly 2 years. Now it felt as though that dream was slipping away in front of everyone. Richard Hale, the company's CEO, stood near the microphone with a confident smile. His expensive suit looked flawless beneath the lights. "This event is for invited presenters," he said, "not people wandering and hoping for a lucky break." A few uncomfortable laughs echoed through the audience. Jaden felt dozens of eyes studying him. Some looked curious. Others looked amused. A few looked sympathetic. The worst part was that many seemed to have already made up their minds. Jaden swallowed and forced himself to stay calm. His grandmother had taught him something years ago. When people expect you to lose your composure, do not give them that victory. "I am not wandering in," Jaden said quietly. "I registered 3 months ago." Richard's smile faded slightly. "And yet your name is not on today's presenter list." Murmurs spread across the room. Several reporters lowered their cameras. A few attendees pulled out phones. Jaden glanced toward the stage where innovators from across the country had spent the morning presenting groundbreaking ideas. He had imagined standing there countless times. Late at night, while other teenagers slept, he had been teaching himself programming through free online courses. He had spent weekends repairing old computer parts, studying code, and building software on a laptop that most people would have thrown away years ago. Every sacrifice had led to this day. Richard folded his arms. "Security can help you find the exit if necessary." The crowd became even quieter. Jaden looked down at the worn laptop. The machine was scratched and outdated, but inside it lived 2 years of work. 2 years of determination. 2 years of believing that talent mattered more than appearances. Slowly, he raised his head. "Would you at least look at the project before deciding?" The question hung in the air. Richard seemed irritated by the challenge. Around the room, people exchanged glances. Some appeared interested for the first time. Others simply wanted to see what would happen next. Near the very back row, an older man in a simple dark jacket watched silently from his seat. Unlike everyone else, he was not whispering or checking his phone. He was studying every detail, every reaction, every word. Nobody paid attention to him. Nobody recognized him. And nobody knew that before the day was over, the quiet man in the last row would change everything. The silence after Jaden's question seemed to stretch across the entire conference hall. Hundreds of people waited for Richard Hale's response. Some leaned forward in their seats. Others glanced between the teenager and the stage as if watching a high-stakes competition. Richard tapped the side of the microphone and forced a small smile. "This is not an open audition," he said. "There are procedures for a reason." A few people nodded. Others appeared less convinced. Jaden remained standing where he was, holding the old laptop against his chest. He knew this moment mattered. Not because of pride, not because he wanted attention, but because inside that aging machine was the software he had spent 2 years building. Every late night after homework, every weekend when friends were outside having fun, every hour spent learning programming languages from free tutorials. If he walked away now, nobody would ever know what he had created. The giant screens above the stage displayed the conference logo while tension continued to grow throughout the room. Several journalists began whispering to one another. A technology blogger near the front row started recording. Even some of the executives looked uncomfortable. The situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Richard folded his arms. "You expect everyone here to believe that a 16-year-old built something important enough to present at this conference?" A few scattered laughs echoed through the audience. Jaden felt the sting of embarrassment, but he refused to react. Instead, he took a slow breath. "I am not asking anyone to believe me," he replied calmly. "I am asking you to look at the work." The answer caused another ripple through the crowd. Several people exchanged surprised glances. The confidence in Jaden's voice did not match the image many had already formed in their minds. Near the back row, the older man in the dark jacket continued watching quietly. His eyes never left the stage. Unlike everyone else, he seemed interested not in the argument, but in the character of the people involved. Richard stepped closer to Jaden. "And what exactly does your software do?" The question finally gave Jaden an opening. His grip on the laptop relaxed slightly. "It identifies inefficiencies in supply chain systems and predicts disruptions before they happen." The room became noticeably quieter. A few engineers immediately looked up from their phones. One investor raised an eyebrow. Supply chain optimization was one of the industry's most difficult challenges. Richard laughed softly. "That is a very ambitious claim." "It is not a claim," Jaden answered. "It is a demonstration." The confidence in his words surprised even the people who doubted him. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on Richard's face. He had expected excuses. He had expected nervousness. Instead, he found a teenager who seemed completely certain of his work. The audience sensed the shift immediately. Curiosity began replacing skepticism. Then someone from the middle row stood up and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Why not let him show it?" Dozens of heads turned. Another voice followed. Then another. Within seconds, the question spread throughout the hall. Why not let him show it? Richard glanced around the room and realized something important. The crowd was no longer focused on removing Jaden. They wanted to see what was inside that old laptop. The atmosphere inside the conference hall had completely changed. Just minutes earlier, people had been watching a teenager being questioned. Now they were waiting to see whether he could back up his confidence. The giant screens above the stage seemed larger than ever as hundreds of attendees focused their attention on the old silver laptop in Jaden Brooks's hands. Richard Hale glanced around the room and realized the audience had already made its decision. They wanted the demonstration. Refusing now would only create more questions. He forced a smile and extended his hand toward the stage. "Fine," he said. "You have 5 minutes." A wave of anticipation swept through the crowd. Several journalists immediately adjusted their cameras. Investors leaned forward in their seats. Engineers opened notebooks. Even people who had been preparing to leave sat back down. Jaden climbed the steps to the stage carefully. The bright lights felt warmer than before. His heart was still racing, but years of preparation helped him stay focused. He had imagined this moment hundreds of times. The only difference was that he had never imagined having to fight for the chance to reach it. He placed the laptop on the presentation table and connected it to the conference display system. The machine took a few seconds to respond. Richard noticed the delay and smirked. "That computer looks older than some of our interns." A few people laughed. Jaden simply waited. The laptop eventually came to life. Its screen glowed softly as rows of code and data appeared. The audience quieted again. There was something unexpected about the way Jaden worked. No panic, no hesitation, no attempt to impress people with complicated language. He moved through the system with confidence, like someone who knew every line of code by memory. "My software analyzes shipping patterns, weather disruptions, inventory movement, and transportation delays," he explained. "Then it predicts supply chain failures before they happen." Several engineers exchanged interested looks. One executive sitting near the front crossed his arms and began paying closer attention. Jaden loaded a simulation. The giant screens instantly filled with maps, graphs, and predictive models. The room became noticeably quieter. Richard's smile faded slightly. The software looked far more sophisticated than he had expected. A logistics specialist near the front whispered something to the person beside her. Another attendee quickly opened a laptop and started taking notes. The energy inside the room was shifting. Jaden continued presenting. Every answer came quickly. Every explanation was clear. Every feature seemed connected to a real-world problem. The audience could feel the difference between someone repeating information and someone who truly understood what they had built. Then one of the investors raised a hand. "How long did it take you to create this?" Jaden looked toward him. "About 2 years." A ripple spread through the room. The investor blinked. 2 years. Jaden nodded. "Mostly nights and weekends." More whispers followed. The software was impressive enough. The timeline made it even more remarkable. Richard shifted uncomfortably beside the stage. For the first time all afternoon, he was no longer controlling the conversation. Then a senior engineer stood up near the center aisle and asked a question that immediately changed everything. "If this works as well as it appears to," he said, Why have we never heard of you before? The room fell silent again. Every eye turned toward Jaden, waiting for his answer. The question lingered in the air long after the engineer sat down. Why had nobody heard of Jaden Brooks before? The giant screens continued displaying the software's predictive models while hundreds of people waited for his answer. The conference hall felt different now. Earlier, people had been skeptical. Now they were genuinely curious. Jaden glanced at the audience before speaking. Because I never had access to rooms like this. The honesty of the answer immediately quieted the crowd. No dramatic speech. No attempt to gain sympathy. Just a simple truth. Several attendees lowered their phones and listened more carefully. Jaden continued. Most companies want experience before they give opportunities. Most opportunities require experience before they let you participate. A few people nodded. The statement felt uncomfortably familiar to many professionals in the room. So I spent my time building instead of waiting. The audience remained silent. Near the front row, one investor leaned back in his chair and folded his arms thoughtfully. Richard Hale tried to regain control of the situation. Building something is one thing, he said. Proving it works in the real world is something else. The comment drew attention back toward the stage. Jaden simply nodded. I agree. The response seemed to catch Richard off guard. He had expected an argument. Instead, Jaden clicked a few keys and opened another section of the software. New charts appeared on the giant screens. Historical shipping records, weather patterns, transportation schedules, real-world data filled the display. 3 months ago, Jaden explained, this system predicted a regional supply disruption in the Midwest 6 days before it happened. Several logistics professionals immediately sat upright. How? Someone called out. Jaden highlighted a series of indicators. Warehouse delays, trucking shortages, and severe weather forecasts. Separately, they looked minor. Together, they created a pattern. The room became completely silent. One executive opened a laptop and started comparing dates. Another checked notes on a tablet. Within seconds, confirmation began spreading through the audience. The prediction matched actual events. Richard's confident posture weakened slightly. The software was not just impressive. It was accurate. A journalist near the center aisle raised a hand. Have you shown this to anyone before? Jaden shook his head. No major company. More murmurs followed. The idea that such a system had been developed outside traditional corporate channels seemed almost impossible. Yet the evidence was sitting directly in front of them. At the back of the room, the older man in the dark jacket continued observing quietly. His expression had not changed, but his attention never wavered. Every answer Jaden gave seemed to increase his interest. Then Richard made a decision. If he could not challenge the software directly, he would challenge its creator. He stepped closer to the stage and pointed toward the old laptop. You expect this audience to believe that all of this was built on that machine? A few nervous laughs returned. The laptop certainly did not look impressive. Its edges were worn. The casing showed years of use. The crack across one corner was impossible to miss. Jaden rested a hand on the device and smiled slightly. Actually, he said, that is the part of the story most people find hardest to believe. The audience leaned forward again. Even the reporters stopped typing. Something in Jaden's voice suggested that what came next might be even more surprising than the software itself. The conference hall remained completely silent. Hundreds of people stared at the old laptop resting on the presentation table. Just minutes earlier, many of them had seen it as proof that Jaden Brooks did not belong in the room. Now they were beginning to wonder if they had misunderstood everything. Jaden rested both hands lightly on the edge of the table and looked toward the audience. I bought this laptop for $40 at a garage sale, he said. A wave of surprised laughter moved through the room. Several people assumed he was joking, but Jaden's expression never changed. The battery did not work. Half the keyboard was broken. The screen flickered every few minutes. The laughter faded. He pointed toward the crack running across one corner of the machine. That happened when it slipped off my desk during a storm. More people leaned forward. The laptop suddenly seemed less like a piece of outdated technology and more like evidence of a long journey. I could not afford a new one, Jaden continued. So I learned how to repair it myself. A reporter lowered her camera and simply listened. An engineer in the front row stopped taking notes. The room was no longer focused on software. They were focused on the person who built it. Jaden opened a folder on the computer. Thousands of files appeared across the screen. Every version of the project is here. He clicked through years of development logs, early prototypes, failed experiments, test results, mistakes, improvements. The audience watched as the timeline stretched back nearly 2 years. The evidence was undeniable. This was not a borrowed project. It was not someone else's work. Every step of the process belonged to him. Richard Hale crossed his arms tightly. He seemed increasingly uncomfortable as the room's attention moved farther away from him. Earlier, he had controlled the conversation. Now he was merely watching it unfold. A venture capitalist near the front row raised her hand. "You build all of this without a team?" Jaden nodded. "Most of the time it was just me." Another investor looked genuinely stunned. "Who taught you?" Jaden smiled slightly. "A lot of people, without realizing it." The audience looked confused. Free tutorials, public research papers, open source communities, developers sharing knowledge online. Several people exchanged thoughtful glances. The answer felt larger than technology. It was about opportunity, about determination, about refusing to wait for permission to learn. Then a voice from the back of the room spoke up. "What made you start building it in the first place?" The question seemed simple, but Jaden hesitated for the first time all afternoon. He looked at the giant screens displaying his work. Then he looked toward the audience. "Because of my grandmother." The room immediately grew quiet again. She worked in warehouses for years. Sometimes delays would cost people hours, sometimes days. "I kept wondering if there was a way to predict those problems before they happened." The honesty in his voice changed the atmosphere completely. This was no longer just a technical presentation. It was personal, human, real. Near the back row, the older man in the dark jacket finally smiled for the first time. Meanwhile, Richard began to realize something dangerous. The audience was no longer judging whether Jaden belonged in the room. They were starting to wonder why nobody had discovered him sooner. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The conference hall felt transformed. The giant screens still displayed Jaden's software, but the focus had shifted entirely to the teenager standing beside the presentation table. Earlier, many people had seen an outsider. Now they were beginning to see a builder, a problem solver, and someone who had earned every bit of attention he was receiving. Richard Hale sensed the change immediately. He could see it in the faces throughout the audience. Investors who had barely looked up from their phones were now fully engaged. Journalists who arrived expecting routine announcements were recording every word. Engineers who normally challenged every claim were nodding along with Jaden's explanations. The momentum was no longer moving in Richard's direction. Determined to regain control, he stepped forward. "A compelling story does not guarantee a successful product," he said. "Business is not about inspiration. It is about results." Several people glanced toward him, but the reaction was noticeably weaker than before. Jaden simply nodded. "That is true." Richard looked surprised by the response. Once again, Jaden refused to argue. Instead, he turned back toward the screen. "That is why I brought results." The audience immediately focused on the display. Jaden opened another section of the program. A detailed comparison chart appeared. Real shipping data filled the screen. Historical disruptions, inventory losses, transportation delays. Then another column appeared beside them. Predicted outcomes generated by his software weeks before those events occurred. A murmur spread through the room. The numbers were remarkably close. One logistics executive stood up from his seat. "Are those real forecasts?" Jaden nodded. "Every one of them." The executive stared at the screen. Those predictions would have saved millions of dollars. More whispers followed. Another investor leaned toward a colleague. A reporter hurriedly typed notes. Richard's expression tightened. He had expected a teenager with potential. What stood before him looked increasingly like someone who had already built something valuable. Then a woman from a major venture capital firm raised her hand. "How many companies have tested this?" Jaden hesitated. "None." The answer shocked the room. "None?" she repeated. "No." Jaden looked around the audience. "Most companies never answer my emails." Silence followed. The statement landed harder than anyone expected. Suddenly, the room was not wondering why they had never heard of Jaden. They were wondering how many opportunities had ignored him. Near the back row, the older man in the dark jacket slowly sat forward in his chair for the first time all afternoon. His eyes remained fixed on Jaden. Meanwhile, Richard realized something alarming. Every challenge he presented seemed to strengthen Jaden's credibility instead of weakening it. Then an engineer near the center aisle stood up. He looked at the screen, then at Jaden. I have spent 12 years working on supply chain optimization, he said. And I have one question. The room grew quiet again. The engineer paused before speaking. If nobody funded this project and no company helped build it, how did you manage to create something this advanced completely on your own? Hundreds of people turned toward Jaden once more, waiting for an answer that might reveal the most surprising part of the entire story. The engineer's question seemed to echo through the conference hall. Hundreds of people remained silent, waiting for Jaden's answer. Even the reporters stopped typing. The giant screens behind the stage continued displaying charts and predictions, but nobody was looking at the software anymore. They were looking at the teenager who had somehow built it. Jaden took a slow breath. For the first time all afternoon, he appeared slightly uncomfortable. Not because he did not know the answer, but because the truth felt personal. I did not really build it alone, he said. A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Richard Hale immediately straightened. Perhaps, he thought, this was finally the weakness everyone had missed. So there was a team, Richard said quickly. Jaden shook his head. No, there was not a team. The room fell quiet again. Then what do you mean? The engineer asked. Jaden glanced down at the old laptop before looking back at the audience. Every time somebody shared knowledge online, they helped. Every programmer who published research helped. Every teacher who uploaded lessons for free helped. Every developer who answered questions in public forums helped. Several people smiled. Others nodded thoughtfully. I never met most of them, Jaden continued. But they made it possible for someone like me to learn. The honesty of the answer seemed to affect the room more than any technical demonstration had. An older executive slowly removed his glasses and sat back in his chair. A venture capitalist who had spent most of the afternoon checking emails now watched Jaden without looking away. The atmosphere had become something entirely different. It was no longer about credentials. It was about character. Then Jaden opened another folder. Thousands of messages appeared on the screen. Rejection emails. Application denials. Unanswered submissions. The audience stared at the overwhelming list. What is this? Someone asked. Jaden gave a small smile. Places I tried to contact. The room became very quiet. He clicked through page after page. Startup incubators. Technology firms. Innovation programs. Scholarship opportunities. Most had never responded. Others had sent polite rejections. One reporter looked genuinely shocked. How many? She asked. Jaden glanced at the number displayed in the corner of the screen. 187. Audible gasps spread throughout the hall. Even Richard looked surprised. 187 attempts. 187 chances to quit. 187 opportunities to give up. Yet somehow he had continued. The engineer who had asked the original question slowly shook his head. Most people would have stopped after 10. Jaden smiled. My grandmother always said that a closed door only tells you where not to knock again. Laughter filled the room. Warm, genuine laughter. For the first time all afternoon, the audience was not viewing Jaden as an outsider. They were seeing him as someone they admired. Near the back row, the older man in the dark jacket finally rose to his feet. The movement was subtle, but several people noticed. Then more heads turned. A whisper spread across the room. Recognition appeared on faces one by one. Because the quiet observer who had watched everything from the beginning was no ordinary attendee. And as he stepped into the aisle and began walking toward the stage, the entire conference suddenly realized who he was. The whisper spread through the conference hall faster than any announcement could have. One person recognized the older man first, then another. Then an entire row of investors turned in their seats. Within seconds, hundreds of people were staring at the figure walking calmly down the center aisle. Jaden watched with confusion. He had noticed the man earlier, sitting quietly in the back row and observing everything without saying a word. But unlike many people in the room, Jaden did not recognize him immediately. The audience did. Charles Whitmore, one of the most respected investors in the technology world. The billionaire whose decisions had helped launch some of the most successful companies in America. Richard Hale's expression changed instantly. Earlier, he had spoken with complete confidence. Now he looked uncertain. Charles continued walking toward the stage with an almost effortless calm. He did not rush. He did not smile. He simply moved forward while the room grew quieter with every step. By the time he reached the front, the conference hall had become completely silent. Charles stopped beside Jaden and looked at the giant screens displaying the software. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he turned toward Jaden. How old are you? He asked. 16, Jaden replied. Charles nodded slowly. And you built this yourself? Yes, sir. Charles looked back at the software. The charts, predictions, and models filled the display behind them. Then he turned toward the audience. I arrived this morning intending to observe a conference. His voice carried easily through the hall. Instead, I witnessed something much more interesting. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. Charles glanced toward Richard. I watched a young man be judged before anyone examined his work. The words landed heavily. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Charles continued. Then I watched that same young man remain respectful when many adults would have become angry. I watched him answer questions with patience. I watched him demonstrate talent instead of demanding recognition. The audience listened in complete silence. Charles turned toward Jaden again. Do you know what impressed me most? Jaden shook his head. Charles smiled slightly. Not the software. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. The character behind it. Several people nodded immediately. They understood exactly what he meant. Charles faced the audience once more. Technology can be taught. Skills can be developed. Markets change. Industries change. But character is different. His voice became firmer. Character determines what people do when nobody believes in them. The room remained silent. Even the reporters seemed unwilling to interrupt the moment. Then Charles looked directly at Richard Hale. The tension became almost unbearable. Earlier today, he said calmly, someone suggested that this young man did not belong here. Richard lowered his eyes. Charles paused for a moment. Then he delivered the sentence that would be remembered long after the conference ended. After everything I have seen today, the only person who does not belong in a room dedicated to innovation is the person who tried to stop it. A collective gasp swept through the audience. Richard stood frozen. Jaden stared at Charles in disbelief. Then something unexpected happened. The entire conference hall rose to its feet. The standing ovation seemed endless. Hundreds of people remained on their feet, applauding not just the software on the screen, but the young man who had refused to give up on himself. Jaden Brooks stood frozen beside the presentation table, overwhelmed by a moment he had never imagined. Just hours earlier, he had walked into the conference hoping someone might listen. Now the entire room was listening. Charles Whitmore waited patiently for the applause to settle before speaking again. I have spent more than 30 years investing in companies, he said. I have reviewed thousands of presentations. I have met founders from around the world. But every so often, you encounter someone who reminds you what innovation is really about. The room fell silent once more. Charles turned toward Jaden. Innovation is not about having the biggest office, the newest equipment, or the loudest voice. It is about solving real problems and refusing to quit when nobody believes in you. Jaden felt his throat tighten. He thought about the countless nights spent teaching himself code. He thought about the rejection emails. He thought about his grandmother encouraging him to keep going every time another opportunity disappeared. Charles reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small business card. The audience watched closely. Jaden, he said, I would like to personally fund the next stage of your project. Audible gasps swept across the hall. Reporters immediately began typing. Investors exchanged stunned looks. Charles continued, not because I feel sorry for you. Not because of what happened today. Because your work earned it. The applause erupted again. Jaden stared at the card in disbelief. For a moment, he could not find the words to respond. Finally, he managed a quiet, sincere, thank you, sir. Charles smiled. You earned this. Near the side of the stage, Richard Hale remained silent. The confidence that had defined him earlier was gone. He looked toward Jaden and then toward the audience. For the first time all afternoon, he seemed to understand the impact of what had happened. After several seconds, he stepped forward. The room grew quiet. Jaden, he said, I owe you an apology. Every camera immediately focused on him. I judged you before I understood your work. I made assumptions I should not have made. I was wrong. The apology was simple, but it mattered. Jaden nodded respectfully. Thank you. There was no anger in his voice. No desire for revenge. Only dignity. The audience responded with another round of applause. Months later, Jaden's software would continue to develop under Charles Whitmore's mentorship. Industry experts would begin testing the system. Opportunities that once seemed impossible would become reality. Yet the image most people remembered was not the investment announcement. It was the sight of a teenager standing calmly under pressure while everyone around him made up their minds too quickly. And on a shelf in Jaden's workspace, beside the old $40 laptop that started it all, sat a framed note from Charles Whitmore containing a single sentence that guided him for years afterward. Never let someone else's assumptions define the size of your future.